Betrayed by my husband infected with HIV, what I did next is shocking. After 26 years sleeping next to the same man, I discovered he betrayed me and infected me with HIV. This is a story I never imagined living, a story that pulled the ground from under my feet, that destroyed the family I believed was perfect, and that forced me to reinvent myself when I thought I already knew everything about life. My name is Ruth Evelyn Scott. I'm 54 years old, and today I'm going to open my heart to you. Ruth often repeats this phrase mentally when people ask who she is. But before reaching this point, she needs to tell how it all began, because no tragedy appears suddenly. It gives signs, small signs that, when ignored, transform into a hurricane capable of destroying everything around. Ruth was born and raised in Centria, a small town in rural Pennsylvania, known for its coal mine and a strange underground flame that, they say, has been burning for decades without going out. Those who aren't from there only know this curiosity, but for Ruth, Centria was always home. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where secrets didn't usually last long, or at least that's what she believed. Ruth met Frank in college. He had that kind of striking presence, tall, with penetrating green eyes and a smile. That seemed to calm any environment. They fell in love quickly, built a solid life together, and for almost 3 decades, Ruth was certain they were on the right path. Frank worked as a supervisor at a local mining company, while Ruth dedicated herself to education as a pedagogical coordinator at the town's only public school. They had 3 children: Rebecca, 24, recently graduated in nursing; Daniel, 22, studying engineering; and Grace, the youngest at 17, still in high school. The family's routine was simple but full of meaning. Frank left early for the mine, Ruth got Grace ready for school, and at night everyone gathered at the table for dinner. On weekends, they had barbecues in the backyard, fishing trips to the nearby river, or visits to the in-laws. If someone looked from the outside, they would see a common, happy, and united family. And indeed, that's how Ruth felt: secure, loved, satisfied. But happiness is sometimes silently corroded by small cracks. Ruth noticed the first changes in Frank about 8 months before her life turned upside down. He began arriving later from work, claiming endless meetings or last-minute problems at the mine. He started going straight to the shower as soon as he arrived, a habit he'd never had. Before, he used to throw himself on the couch, ask for coffee, and relax with Ruth in the kitchen. Now the rush to clean himself seemed to hide something. Another difference was with his phone. Previously left anywhere in the house, now it seemed like an extension of his hand. Frank took it even to the bathroom, always locked with a password. When Ruth asked, he responded with short phrases: "It's just work stuff, Ruth." But there was something in that posture that bothered her. Ruth also began to notice a change in Frank's appearance. He had always been practical, almost careless, but suddenly decided to renew his wardrobe. He bought more sophisticated perfumes, cut his hair in a more modern style. When she complimented him, he just mumbled, "I want to feel more professional." The answer didn't convince her. Ruth tried to get closer, seek more intimacy, but was met with coldness. One night, when she hugged him from behind in the bathroom, he pulled away abruptly, as if her touch was uncomfortable. "I'm tired, Ruth. Work is demanding," he said impatiently. When she questioned if something was wrong between them, she heard, "You're being paranoid." That word kept hammering in Ruth's mind. Was she really creating problems? At 54, it was impossible not to think, if time wasn't taking its toll. Was she no longer attractive? Do all long marriages go through this kind of cooling off? Ruth found herself in a spiral of self-criticism, trying to justify what, deep down, she knew wasn't right. What really shook Ruth was when Grace, the youngest, commented innocently while they were making pancakes. "Mom, Dad's been acting strange. Yesterday I tried to show him my math grade and he didn't even listen to me. It was like I didn't exist." If even their daughter noticed, then it wasn't Ruth's imagination. The family dinner, which had always been a moment of connection, became a silent formality. Frank no longer talked about colleagues, work problems, or company gossip. He limited himself to dry responses. "Normal, nothing much. You wouldn't understand." An invisible wall had risen between them. Ruth could see him, but could no longer reach him. Over time, Ruth realized that intimacy had completely disappeared. Excuses like headaches, fatigue, or worries became routine. When she tried to bring up the subject, Frank deflected, accusing her of demanding too much. Ruth's heart screamed that something was wrong, but her mind insisted on denying it. She clung to the hope that it was just a phase. Deep down, however, Ruth already knew. The instinct built over more than 2 decades of living together told her that something serious was hiding behind each excuse, each averted look. Still, she didn't have the courage to face it head-on, because sometimes ignorance seems to be the last refuge of peace. But life doesn't usually give the luxury of choosing when the truth will come to light. And at that moment, Ruth still had no idea that what she was about to discover wouldn't just be marital betrayal. It would be a sentence that would change her existence, that would forever transform her way of seeing love, trust, and even herself. Ruth thought she was only facing the risk of losing her marriage, but what was coming was much deeper, the risk of losing her own life. The changes in Frank became impossible to ignore. The man who came home eager to share work stories now entered through the door with silence and haste. He left a quick kiss on Ruth's cheek and rushed straight to the shower, as if he needed to erase invisible traces before sitting with the family. Ruth began to notice details that screamed. A different perfume on his shirt, a sweet young fragrance completely distinct from the woody scent Frank had always used. When she questioned lightly, the response was dry. "It's just work stuff, someone." Passed by. Ruth felt it was a lie but swallowed it in silence. On another occasion, she found an empty gift box in the car. Frank said he had bought something for his mother, but Ruth never saw this gift reach her mother-in-law's hands. The couple's intimacy transformed into emptiness. Ruth approached. Frank pulled away. She sought his gaze. He averted it. Gradually, Ruth began to feel invisible within her own home. When she tried to talk about it, Frank's reaction was explosive. He said she was exaggerating, that she saw problems in everything, that she was paranoid. The word echoed like poison, making Ruth doubt herself. Grace, always observant, commented with the innocence of someone who still believes adults tell the truth. "Mum, Dad is acting strange. It seems like he doesn't see us anymore." Ruth's heart tightened. If even their daughter noticed, then it wasn't a figment of imagination. Family dinners became uncomfortable silences. Ruth asked about Frank's day and received automatic responses. "Normal. Nothing much. You wouldn't understand." Each word was a stone in the wall he erected between them. Ruth could see her husband, but could no longer reach him. The doubts corroded Ruth's self-esteem. She looked at herself in the mirror, wondering if she was still attractive, if time had erased the shine that once made her chosen by Frank. She thought about changes in her own body, about dyeing her hair, renewing her wardrobe, as if the problem was her. But a voice insisted, "It's not that. What you feel is real. He's hiding something." One night, Ruth prepared a special dinner, served Frank's favorite wine, and hoped the atmosphere would open space for conversation. He remained distant, fiddling with his phone, not noticing her effort. When Ruth tried to touch his hand on the table, Frank discreetly pulled back as if the gesture was uncomfortable. That was like an invisible punch. Ruth began losing sleep, lying next to a man who seemed to sleep peacefully while her mind spun in circles of doubt and fear. She clung to denial because accepting the truth would be too painful. But the instinct, built over 26 years of marriage, wouldn't leave her in peace. Something was wrong, and she was about to discover that the signs were just the surface of an ocean of lies. Ruth believed she would only face the pain of possible infidelity, but in a simple medical consultation, life would show that betrayal was just the tip of a much deeper abyss. Ruth never imagined that a simple routine exam could become the greatest tragedy of her life. It was on a May morning when she decided it was time to take better care of her health. She felt a strange fatigue, an uneasiness she tried to attribute to age or work stress, but something inside her said she needed answers. She scheduled an appointment with Dr. Williams, her trusted doctor for over 15 years, a gray-bearded man with a welcoming gaze who had known the family since they moved to Centria. In the cold, organized room, He received her with that calm manner as always. After a quick conversation, he suggested they do a complete checkup. Blood tests, hormones, mammography, pap smear, everything women Ruth's age need to monitor. Ruth agreed without hesitation. It was then that, among the papers she was filling out, he looked up and suggested something that made her shudder. "Let's include a complete STD panel, Ruth. Hepatitis, syphilis, HIV too. I recommend it for all sexually active patients, regardless of marital status." At that moment, Ruth felt a chill she couldn't explain. She asked almost voicelessly if that was really necessary. After all, she had been married for over 2 decades, never used drugs, never received blood transfusions. He just looked at her patiently and responded, "I understand your surprise, but HIV can remain for years without showing signs. Many people only discover it in routine exams. It's just a precaution, nothing more." Ruth nodded silently, but her heart was beating fast, as if her body sensed that this decision would change everything. At the laboratory, Ruth offered her arm to the nursing technician with cold hands. The technician, trying to ease the tension, commented, "These tests always make us nervous, don't they? But it's better to know than to live in ignorance." Ruth forced a smile, but those words echoed strongly within her. Did she really want to know? On the way back home, she gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to push away thoughts that suffocated her. It didn't make sense to feel so much fear, and yet she trembled. The following days were torture. Frank continued distant, increasingly attached to his phone and work excuses. Ruth looked at him and wondered, what if there's something he's not telling me? What if this exam will reveal the truth I so fear? She tried to push these thoughts away, but each night he turned his face to the other side of the bed. The fear grew. That week, the phone rang at a common moment in Ruth's day, while she was organizing school activities. She immediately recognized the number from the office. She answered with frozen hands. Dr. Williams' voice sounded grave, different from usual. "Ruth, I need you to come to my office this afternoon so we can talk about the results." Ruth's breathing failed. Doctors don't call to give good news. She asked if he could advance something, but he insisted, "I prefer to speak in person." The rest of the day was torment. Ruth's mind created 1,000 scenarios: high cholesterol, diabetes, some hormonal problem. Everything seemed less frightening than the possibility that infiltrated her thoughts. What if it's HIV? Ruth arrived at the office early, unable to wait at home. The receptionist, always smiling, avoided looking at her. The silence in the waiting room was deafening. When she was finally called, Ruth's legs trembled so much she could barely cross the hallway. Dr. Williams received her with a look of compassion Ruth had never seen. He asked her to sit and took a deep breath before speaking. "Ruth, I have difficult news to give you. Your HIV test came back positive." Ruth felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. The sound of those words echoed as if coming from another planet. "No, this can't be right," she managed to stammer. "I've been married for 26 years. I've never had another relationship." He then explained, with a calm but firm voice, that they had repeated the test 3 times and the result was the same. There was no error. Ruth's mind spun. HIV, a word that until then seemed to belong to other realities, to distant people, television stories, or public health campaigns. And now it was inside her. The tears came in waves, uncontrolled, an animal. Cry deep that she couldn't contain. "Am I going to die?" she asked, sobbing. The doctor held her hand firmly. "Ruth, listen carefully. HIV today is no longer a death sentence. With proper treatment, you can have a long, healthy, and practically normal life. It's not about the end, but about a new way of living. But how to think about the future when the present had just shattered?" Ruth left there with a pile of pamphlets, support group contacts, and the recommendation to start treatment soon. The doctor's words echoed, "It's not a death sentence." But inside her, it seemed like she had died right there. With each step toward the car, the question hammered, how am I going to face Frank? Did he know? Was he the one who brought this into our home? Ruth drove back home without remembering the route, as if in a trance. She parked in the garage and stayed inside the car for long minutes, paralyzed. How to tell Frank? How to pretend? Normalcy in front of the children? The world she believed she knew had just collapsed, and she still didn't know how to take the first step into this new reality. Ruth was still trying to convince herself there was some mistake, but deep down she already knew. The truth was connected to the man who slept beside her every night, and how she would confront him would forever change the family's course. That rainy day, Ruth returned home carrying the weight of a secret that seemed to crush her chest. The HIV diagnosis still echoed in her mind like endless thunder. Each time the word positive returned to her thoughts, she felt as if she were being struck again. She entered the house in silence, trying to appear normal to her youngest daughter, but inside she felt like a stranger in her own body. It was as if her skin no longer belonged to her. Ruth spent the night awake, lying next to Frank. He snored softly as if nothing had changed. She, with her eyes open, stared at the dark ceiling, thinking about every detail of the last few weeks. The excuses, the delays, the immediate showers, the perfume that wasn't his. Everything fit into a cruel narrative. Betrayal. And worse, not just betrayal, but its consequence now running through her veins. Ruth tried to push this thought away, but it was impossible. The body's pain hadn't arrived yet, but the soul's pain was already consuming her entirely. The next morning, Ruth decided she needed to face him. She waited until dinner, when Grace had already gone up to her room. She looked into Frank's eyes and said with a firm voice, despite the trembling in her hands, "I had routine exams. The result came back positive for HIV." For a few seconds, he remained motionless, as if he hadn't understood. Then he dropped his fork on the plate and stared at her with an expression that mixed shock and disbelief. "That's impossible, Ruth. There must be some error. You need to repeat this test." Ruth responded without hesitation. "It was repeated 3 times. There's no error." She saw his shoulders tense, his eyes avoid hers. Frank stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth in the kitchen like a cornered animal. He repeated disconnected phrases. "It doesn't make sense. You never used drugs, never received transfusions. How could this have happened?" Ruth just watched him, letting his performance unfold before her. Deep down, she already knew the answer. "So explain to me, Frank," she finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "If I've always been with you, if I've never been with another man, how do you think I contracted HIV?" He stopped, turned to her, and tried to maintain an indignant look. "What are you insinuating? That I—" Ruth didn't need to let him finish. She completed it herself. "Yes, I'm insinuating exactly that, and I want you to take the test immediately." Frank swallowed hard, and for the first time Ruth perceived true fear in his expression. There was no more escape. He nodded with a quick gesture, trying to recover his composure. "All right, I'll take the test tomorrow." But inside Ruth, she no longer had doubts. The way he averted his gaze, the trembling in his hands, the rush to change the subject, everything confirmed what she feared. That night was unbearable. They shared the same bed, but there was an ocean between them. Ruth closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but each breath of his reminded her of the lie they sustained. She thought about the children, how they would react, how the family would never be the same. Betrayal was already devastating by itself, but the disease was the irreparable wound. In the following days, the house transformed into a minefield. Every word spoken was measured. Every silence seemed like a muffled scream. Grace perceived the tension and asked if everything was okay. Ruth said yes, but her voice sounded strange even to herself. She was no longer the confident mother Grace knew. While they waited for Frank's test result, Ruth began to observe every detail with a detective's eye. Every work delay, every phone message, every unknown perfume. Everything seemed like a clue. Suspicion grew in her like poison. Each passing day, Ruth was more certain that her husband had not only betrayed her, but had also condemned her to live with a burden she didn't choose to carry. Ruth tried to convince herself that maybe Frank also didn't know, that he could have been deceived or surprised. But this hope lasted little. She remembered the way he pulled away when she tried to touch him. the aggressiveness in his responses, the rush to shower when arriving home. None of this was casual. None of this was innocent. And then came the certainty that destroyed Ruth. Inside, she wasn't just facing betrayal. She was facing a conscious choice. Frank knew there were risks, knew he was putting her in danger, and even so preferred silence. He not only betrayed her as a wife, but betrayed her as a woman, as a mother, as a human being. That week, for the first time in 26 years of marriage, Ruth wished Frank would sleep in another room. She didn't say it out loud, but the thought corroded her. She could no longer bear sharing the same space with someone who had destroyed the most sacred trust she had. Ruth knew that his test would confirm what her heart was already screaming. And when that happened, there would be no going back. Frank's test was scheduled for Monday. But even before the result, the way he tried to deny and disguise made it clear to Ruth betrayal was already written in every gesture, and the definitive confrontation would be inevitable. Monday dawned heavy, with an overcast sky and a cold wind that seemed to pierce through the house walls. It was the day Frank would take the test. Ruth observed every movement of his that morning, as if seeking to decipher secrets hidden in the simplest gestures. He avoided her gaze, kept his eyes down while getting dressed, and when he finally left through the door, Ruth felt as if he carried with him a part of the truth he still insisted on hiding. Ruth spent the day on high alert, unable to concentrate, on work. The sound of the phone startled her. Colleagues' voices at school seemed distant. When she returned home, she found Frank already sitting in the living room, leafing through the newspaper as if nothing had happened. Ruth pretended normalcy, but inside her anger grew like a flame about to consume everything. She waited until Grace retreated to her room. The tension in the house was so palpable that even she, without knowing, seemed to walk in silence to avoid friction. Then Ruth took a deep breath and decided she wouldn't postpone anymore. "Frank, we need to talk." He didn't lift his eyes from the newspaper. "Again, Ruth? We already talked about this. You're torturing yourself for no reason." That was the spark needed for the explosion Ruth was trying to contain. "For no reason? Do you really believe I'm going to swallow this lie? I have HIV, Frank. 3 tests confirmed it. 3. You know what this means, and you know very well where it came from." This time he dropped the newspaper and stared at her. The silence between them lasted a few seconds that seemed eternal. Then, with an altered voice, Frank responded, "What are you accusing me of? Of bringing this into our home? I'm your husband of 26 years. Ruth's breathing became short. Her whole body trembled. "And it's precisely because you're my husband, of 26 years, that I know who you are. I know every gesture of yours, every poorly told lie. You changed, Frank. You don't need to pretend anymore. I just want you to admit it." He stood up suddenly, began walking back and forth, hands in his hair, as if seeking an exit. "This doesn't make sense. Maybe you got contaminated another way. Maybe at work or in some medical exam." "Stop it." Ruth's voice came out loud, almost a scream. "Don't invent ridiculous excuses. You know the truth and I know it too. You need to face what you did." The sound of her voice echoed through the house, and it was at that moment Ruth noticed the hallway door opening slowly. Grace was there with wide eyes, observing the scene without fully understanding, but feeling the weight of gravity. "Why are you shouting?" Grace asked, her voice choked with fear. Ruth tried to compose herself immediately. "It's nothing, dear. It's just a discussion about work." But the lie came out harsh, almost grotesque. Grace stood still for a few seconds, not believing, until she withdrew in silence. That broke Ruth's heart. Their daughter didn't know the truth, but already felt the damage it caused. Frank sat down again, now with his head in his hands. "I swear. Ruth, I don't know how this happened. I'll take the test and then we'll understand everything." Ruth looked at him and saw only fear. It wasn't the fear of someone who fears for their health, but of someone who knows the mask is about to fall. "You will take the test, yes. But understand, Frank, this is no longer a matter of suspicion. The truth is already here, inside us, and your cowardice in admitting it only increases the pain." That night, they slept side by side once more, but the silence between them screamed louder than any word. Frank seemed to want to believe he could hide reality until the last moment, as if the lie were a blanket capable of warming a freezing truth. Ruth, on the other hand, knew she was facing a point of no return. The test would just be official confirmation of what her heart was already certain of. Deep down, there was still a part of Ruth that wanted to believe in some innocence, in some improbable explanation that wouldn't destroy the family. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was unresolved love. But each time she remembered the word positive stamped on the laboratory paper, Ruth felt any remnant of doubt dissolve. She was no longer just a wife. She had become a victim of the cruelest lie someone could commit. While sleep wouldn't come, Ruth kept thinking about how to tell the children, how to tell them that their father had not only betrayed the family's trust, but had also brought into the house a disease that would change their lives forever. She wondered if they would be able to forgive, if they would look at Frank with the same contempt Ruth was already beginning to feel. Frank slept, or pretended to sleep. Ruth remained awake, staring at the ceiling and listening to each beat of her own heart, as if they were hammer blows announcing the inevitable collapse. Dawn seemed endless, and inside her the certainty grew that when the sun rose, life would never be the same again. Frank's test would confirm what Ruth already knew. Precisely because of this, she wasn't willing to wait sitting down. If he wouldn't tell the truth, she would go after the proof herself. And what she found was even more devastating than she imagined. Ruth knew there was no point in just waiting for the test results anymore. Frank's silence, his averted looks, and his fragile excuses were already enough to corrode any remnant of trust. She needed the naked truth, even if it destroyed her inside. It was on a Friday, while Frank was at work and Grace at school, that Ruth made a decision she would have, sworn she'd never be capable of making, going through his things. Ruth opened the first dresser drawer with her heart racing. Her hands trembled so much it seemed impossible to hold any object. At first, just carelessly folded clothes, but soon she found a crumpled receipt from a restaurant in Scranton, dated a few weeks ago. That night, Frank had said he would stay, late in a meeting. The restaurant's name, elegant and romantic, left no doubt it wasn't a business dinner. Ruth felt her stomach turn. She continued searching, increasingly determined, even though each new discovery was like a stab wound. In a folder hidden at the bottom of the drawer, she found purchase receipts from a luxury florist, a jewelry store where Frank had never bought anything for her, and finally, the final blow: a hotel receipt. Paradise Inn Hotel, room 142 on the EE. Same night, Ruth had prepared a special dinner for the two of them at home. She remembered waiting alone that night, keeping the plate warm until dawn, and felt tears streaming uncontrollably. But the worst was yet to come. At the bottom of the drawer there was a small velvet box. Inside it, a delicate silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant and the inscription, "Forever yours." Ruth had never received that gift. The jewelry wasn't for her. She felt heat rise through her body, a mixture of rage, pain, and humiliation. She photographed each piece of evidence with her phone, as if she needed to save it to prevent Frank from denying it later. Her mind still consumed by fury, Ruth decided to go further. She knew some of the passwords Frank used, always variations of the children's names or anniversary dates. She turned on the office computer and, after a few attempts, managed to get in. What she found made her collapse in the chair. The browsing history was full of searches like how to hide STD symptoms, discreet HIV treatments, and how to know if I'm infected. The shock was so great that Ruth felt short of breath. Frank already suspected. He knew something was wrong, and even so continued to share the bed with her as if nothing was happening. Ruth went through the emails, and after recovering messages Frank had tried to delete, came across confirmation of the name that already haunted her nightmares: Melissa. The message exchanges between them were intimate, full of cheap declarations and secret meetings arranged in hotels and restaurants. In one of them, Melissa said she was worried because she had contracted something and needed urgent tests. The date was 3 months before Ruth discovered her diagnosis. In other words, Frank already knew about the risk. He had already been warned. Even so, he continued sleeping with Ruth without saying a single word. Ruth ran to the bathroom and vomited everything she had eaten that morning. It was as if the poison of lies had contaminated every part of her body. Then, with still trembling hands, she printed the most compromising emails and kept them in a hidden folder. She didn't know yet what she would do, but she knew she needed physical evidence. Her word against his wasn't enough. That night was one of the longest in Ruth's life. Frank came home with the same fake smile, trying to talk about trivialities, as if nothing was happening. Ruth looked at him and could only see a stranger, a man who had turned their lives into an elaborate farce. During dinner, he casually commented, "My results come out Monday. I'm sure everything will be negative. I think there was some error with your tests." Ruth just forced a smile and replied, "I hope you're right." Inside, her desire was to scream, throw all the evidence in his face, but she restrained herself. She wanted to see how far he would sustain that lie. Ruth spent the weekend on high alert, every gesture from Frank disgusting her. He tried to be more attentive, perhaps to cover up his guilt, but that only increased her revulsion. The forced hugs, the questions about how she was, the sudden care with small household tasks. Everything seemed like a cheap performance to Ruth. She saw the mask and knew that behind it there was only fear of being unmasked. On Sunday night, Ruth couldn't take it anymore. She decided to investigate once more. Melissa's name wouldn't leave her head. She went to the office and took the company directory where Frank worked. She flipped through the pages until she found her photo. Melissa Chen, Human Resources Department. Young, beautiful, with that kind of radiant smile that seemed made to deceive. Ruth immediately remembered the times Frank had mentioned her casually, always in work context. Melissa organized the training. Melissa is handling the benefits policy. Melissa stayed late with me finishing a report. The pieces finally fit together. Ruth searched for Melissa's name on social media. The profile was partially private, but some photos were public. In one of them, recent, there was the necklace Ruth had found hidden in Frank's drawer shining on Melissa's neck. The same pendant with the words, "Forever yours." Ruth didn't need anything more to confirm what she already knew. Frank had not only betrayed her, but was also giving his mistress symbols of eternal love while Ruth, his wife, cooked dinners alone at home. Rage consumed Ruth in a way she had never experienced. Her hands trembled. Her whole body seemed to burn. It wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. It was putting her life at risk consciously and deliberately. For the first time since discovering the diagnosis, Ruth didn't cry. Instead, she felt an ice take over her, a coldness that gave her strength to wait for Monday to arrive. Because when the test confirmed what she already knew, there would be no more escape for Frank. That Monday, fate would put them face to face with the truth. Frank's result would confirm Ruth's suspicions, and, in a few hours, the entire family would know the devastation he had caused. Monday seemed to have dawned, darker than usual. The heavy sky, low clouds, and the feeling of oppression in the air matched what Ruth felt inside. Frank left early, saying he was going to the laboratory, but he didn't even need to tell Ruth. She knew exactly where he was going, and also knew what he would find. Ruth spent the day pacing back and forth around the house, unable to concentrate on any task. Her mind could only imagine Frank's expression when he finally had in his hands the result that would confirm everything. In the afternoon, when Ruth heard the sound of the car entering the garage, her heart raced. She ran to the kitchen window and saw Frank sitting at the wheel for a few minutes, motionless, as if he didn't have the courage to get out. When he finally entered, he carried in his hand a white envelope that seemed to weigh tons. He tried to smile, but his look betrayed the opposite. "Everything went well, Ruth. It was just a misunderstanding." Ruth stared at him in silence without moving a muscle. "Then show me the result." Frank hesitated, which was already the answer Ruth needed. He opened the envelope with trembling hands, took out the folded sheet, and placed it on the table. The words were there in cold laboratory letters, HIV positive. For an instant, the silence was absolute. Ruth felt a wave of heat course through her body, a mixture of rage, pain, and a certain cruel relief, because finally there was no more room for lies. "So that's it," Ruth murmured, almost voiceless. "You betrayed me, and now it's clear to all of us." Frank put his hands to his face, crying convulsively. "I didn't want it to be like this. I didn't know she was sick, I swear, Ruth." That confession, which should have brought some kind of explanation, only increased Ruth's revulsion. "You didn't know? How many times did you sleep with me knowing there was a risk? How many times did you look into my eyes and lie to me? It's not just the betrayal, Frank, it's the cowardice. It's our entire family's life that you put at stake." It was at that moment that Grace came down the stairs, attracted by the sound of the argument. Behind her, Rebecca and Daniel, who had come to spend the week at home, appeared in the hallway. 3 pairs of attentive, frightened eyes, staring at the scene they should never have witnessed. Ruth didn't want it to be like this, but the truth exploded there in front of everyone. Rebecca was the first to speak. "Mom, what's happening?" Ruth swallowed hard but couldn't protect anyone. "Your father betrayed me and we both have HIV." The words came out hard, heavy, and echoed through the room like a gunshot. Rebecca put her hand to her mouth, incredulous. Daniel exploded in fury, lunging at his father with clenched fists. "You ruined everything, you bastard! How could you do this to our mother? How could you do this to us?" Frank tried to contain him, but Daniel broke free, trembling with rage. Grace, poor thing, cried silently, hugging the stair railing as if her world had ended. Frank tried to justify himself through tears. "I made mistakes, but I still love you. It was a slip-up. I didn't want it to reach this point." Ruth interrupted, him with a cutting voice. "A slip-up? Years of lies, hidden meetings, gifts, even exchanged messages about her disease. That's not a slip-up, Frank, that's choice. You chose to betray, chose to hide, and chose to expose me." Rebecca, who until then couldn't speak, finally spoke up. "You're no longer my father. A man who destroys his own family this way doesn't deserve that title." The harshness in her words was a blow Ruth saw hit Frank squarely. He cried, tried to hug them, but the children pulled away as if he were a stranger. The living room, which had so often been the stage for laughter, family dinners, and cozy moments, now transformed into a courtroom. Ruth was the witness, the children were the judges, and Frank the defendant, condemned by his own choices. There was no possible defense, no acceptable justification. Only silence, tears, and an emptiness that seemed to grow in every corner of the house. That night, for the first time in 26 years, Frank slept in the guest room. The sound of the door closing behind him was both painful and liberating for Ruth. She lay in bed with swollen eyes, listening to Grace's muffled crying in the next room. Rebecca spent the night on the couch, unable to look at her father, and Daniel left the house, saying he needed air. They were a broken family, shattered inside, and all because of a lie sustained for too long. Lying in the darkness, Ruth realized that something in her had also changed. The love she once felt no longer existed. Only a deep hole remained where trust and affection once were, and in that emptiness something new began to be born, a silent strength, a will not to allow this pain to define the rest of her life. The pain was unbearable, but Ruth knew she needed to get up. Between tears and medicine, she found support where she least expected it, and it was there that the first spark of resistance began to emerge. The following days were a dive into shadows. The revelation had shattered the family and left scars that still bled in silence. Frank's positive result, the forced confession in front of the children, the tears that flooded every corner of the house, all of that seemed like a nightmare from which Ruth couldn't wake up. And yet, life didn't stop. It was necessary to continue, even when every movement seemed to require strength she no longer had. The next morning, the alarm rang like any other day, but getting out of bed was like carrying a ton on her shoulders for Ruth. Still, Grace needed her. School was waiting for her. Life insisted on continuing. Ruth took the first antiretroviral treatment pill with trembling hands. That small medicine, which would now be part of her daily routine, tasted like iron and reality. It was the bitter reminder that she couldn't escape what had happened. The side effects began in the first few days. Nausea, dizziness, a fatigue that seemed to steal energy even to walk around the house. Ruth looked at herself in the mirror and saw a pale face, eyes marked by poorly slept nights. She was no longer the same woman who believed she had life under control. She was someone trying to relearn how to exist with a weight she never asked to carry, and it was in this scenario that Grace became Ruth's unexpected pillar. At only 17 years old, she demonstrated a maturity Ruth couldn't have imagined. She sat beside her mother while she fought against nausea, prepared ginger tea, brought blankets, reminded Ruth of medicine schedules. "It will pass, Mom. You're strong," Grace would say, holding Ruth's hand firmly. Her words were simple but echoed like a reminder that Ruth still had reasons to resist. Rebecca, on the other hand, remained cold and distant. The pain of her father's betrayal seemed to have transformed into a barrier between her and Ruth as well. Rebecca spoke little, avoided long conversations, and sometimes Ruth caught her watching, her with a look mixed with pity and anger. Daniel took refuge outside the house, appearing only to see Grace occasionally, but not staying for long. Ruth understood. Each one processed the tragedy in their own way. But seeing the children away from the home that was once full of laughter was like a second punishment. It was during one of the follow-up consultations that Dr. Williams suggested Ruth look for a support group. "Ruth, you need to talk to people who understand exactly what you're going through. It will help deal with loneliness and fear." Ruth was reluctant at first. The idea of exposing herself, of telling strangers what deeply embarrassed her, seemed impossible. But on a particularly difficult night, when nausea wouldn't let her sleep and Grace's crying echoed through the hallway, she decided to try. The following week, Ruth went to a Methodist church in Scranton, where a group of people living with HIV met. She entered with her heart racing, fearing judgmental looks, but found something completely different. There were men, women, young people, elderly, all united by the same pain and the same need to start over. Each one told a piece of their story, and when it was Ruth's turn, her voice failed. But as she spoke aloud about the betrayal, about the years of marriage, about the brutal discovery, Ruth felt as if part of the weight left her chest. An elderly lady named Margaret, over 60 years old, approached at the end of the meeting and hugged Ruth. "You will survive, Ruth, and not just survive, you will rebuild yourself. I also thought my life was over when I received the diagnosis, but today, 7 years later, I'm here. It's not easy, but it's possible." Those words were like a breath of hope in the middle of the desert. For the first time since the diagnosis, Ruth imagined that maybe there was life after chaos. Frank, meanwhile, tried to get closer, as if he could still recover something. He prepared coffee, left notes in the kitchen, tried to talk. Ruth didn't respond. The man she knew had disappeared. What remained was a stranger who carried in his body and attitudes the living proof of her pain. There was no longer room for forgiveness. Ruth knew that sooner or later divorce would be inevitable. In that phase, each small victory seemed enormous to Ruth. Managing to spend a day without vomiting, teaching a class without crying, hidden in the school bathroom, hearing Grace laugh at some joke, and feeling that there was still normalcy in the air, all of this gave Ruth reasons to believe she could resist. It still hurt, it was still heavy, but she was standing. And it was in this fragile balance between tears and small new beginnings that Ruth began to see something that until then seemed impossible. She wasn't just a victim. Ruth still had choice. She could decide whether she would live as a hostage to pain or as someone capable of transforming it into strength. The path would be long, but the first spark of resistance had been born. Over time, the decision became inevitable. Divorce was the only way out. But what Ruth didn't imagine was that, by breaking with the past, she would find a new reason to live. The divorce didn't happen overnight. There were months of silence, short and cold conversations, looks that no longer met. Frank still lived, at home, but it was as if he were just an unwanted guest, someone who moved through the rooms without really belonging to them. Ruth avoided crossing his path, and when it was inevitable, she responded with short, dry phrases. There was nothing more to be said between them. Frank tried to apologize, sometimes cried, sometimes blamed Ruth for not wanting to listen. But it no longer mattered. The decision was made inside her. Ruth would not share the rest of her life with a man who had destroyed everything she believed in. Ruth hired a lawyer in Scranton. She remembers holding the pen with trembling hands to sign the first papers. It was as if part of her still resisted the idea of ending a 26-year marriage, but at the same time a feeling of relief took over her body. It was the beginning of a new chapter, even if still painful. When she finally communicated to Frank, his face fell apart. "Ruth, don't do this. We can fix this." Ruth shook her head, slowly. "There's no fixing, Frank. You didn't just destroy our marriage, you broke our family, our trust. There's no going back." Rebecca, who had distanced herself since the revelation, finally came home one weekend. They sat on the porch and she looked at Ruth with teary eyes. "Mom, I didn't know how to deal with all this, but I'm proud of you, proud that you're not accepting less than you deserve." That brought Ruth unexpected peace. It was as if little by little, she was reconquering not only herself but also her children's respect. Daniel was still hurt, carried his father's anger like a weight, but also began to get closer. And Grace, always Ruth's greatest companion, continued by her side, firm, holding her mother's hand when the nights were too long. The treatment continued, and with it came better days. The side effects diminished, Ruth's body began to adapt. She still felt fragile, but also more alive than in the first months. The support group meetings became an essential part of her routine. There, Ruth learned she wasn't alone, that thousands of people lived the same reality and found ways to move forward. Hearing stories of overcoming made Ruth believe she could also write hers. It was at one of these meetings that someone invited Ruth to share her testimony at a small community lecture. Her first reaction was to refuse. The shame was still too great. The fear of judgment still paralyzed her. But Margaret, the lady who had welcomed Ruth at the first meeting, said, "You have no idea how many people can find hope hearing your story." That kept hammering in Ruth's mind. The following week she accepted. That night, in a simple room with aligned chairs and attentive faces, Ruth told her story for the first time in public. Her voice trembled, her hands sweated, but as the words came out, Ruth felt something change inside her. The pain that was once just a solitary weight began to transform into something different, purpose. When she finished, some people came to hug her, saying Ruth's words had touched them deeply. Ruth left there with tears in her eyes, but for the first time they were tears of something that wasn't just sadness. Over time, this purpose expanded. Ruth was invited to speak at schools, then at larger conferences. With each new meeting, her voice gained firmness, her story gained strength. Ruth was no longer just the betrayed woman, no longer just the victim of a lie. She was becoming someone who transformed pain into learning, despair into courage. At home, Ruth's relationship with her children was rebuilding. Rebecca began visiting her frequently, bringing flowers and stories from the hospital where she worked as a nurse. Daniel, still marked by anger, began channeling his energy into studies and called Ruth almost every day to see how she was. Grace flourished before Ruth's eyes, matured by early pain, but also proud of the mother who learned to get up after the fall. Frank, meanwhile, distanced himself more and more. The divorce process advanced, and when the sentence finally came out, Ruth felt as if a gigantic weight was lifted from her shoulders. She didn't cry. She just took a deep breath and moved forward. And so, little by little, the woman who had lost herself in the middle of tragedy began to be reborn. There were still difficult days, there were still nights of crying, but now there were also days of hope, of achievements, of small victories that added up. Rebuilding strength wasn't just surviving, it was learning to live again. A year and a half later, Ruth was no longer the same. HIV continued with her, but no longer defined her. And it was in this new moment of life that she discovered, even the deepest pain can be transformed into purpose. A year and a half had passed since that day, when Ruth heard for the first time the word that would forever change her life: positive. A year and a half since the ground disappeared under her feet, since her family crumbled before the cruelest truth she could ever imagine. And yet, there was Ruth, alive. Not just alive, reborn. HIV still ran through Ruth's veins, but no longer defined her. The scars still existed, but stopped being open wounds to transform into marks of resistance. Ruth no longer looked in the mirror and saw only a victim. She saw a woman who had crossed through fire and somehow learned to dance among the ashes on that specific day. Ruth was in Washington before an audience of more than 200 people at a national HIV conference. The invitation had arrived weeks before, and she confesses to having hesitated to accept. Shame, fear of judgment, still tried to whisper inside her. But there was something stronger now, the certainty that her story wasn't just hers. It also belonged to everyone who, in silence, faced similar battles. When Ruth went up on stage, the lights blinded her for an instant. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She told about her 26-year marriage, about the signs she ignored, about the devastating diagnosis, about the day the children discovered the truth. She told about the treatment, the side effects, the sleepless nights, but also about the support groups, the unexpected friendships, and the strength that was born in the middle of pain. Each word was an open wound, but also a testimony that it was possible to survive. At the end, the room was in absolute silence. Then a woman from the audience stood up with tears in her eyes and said, "You gave me hope today. I received my diagnosis 3 months ago and thought my life was over. Now I believe I can continue." At that moment, Ruth knew that all the suffering, however cruel it had not been in vain. Her pain had transformed into purpose. Today, when Ruth looks back, she sees not only the betrayal, the disease, and the destruction of the family. She also sees the woman who learned to get up, who found voice in the middle of silence, and who discovered that even in the darkest nights, there can be a flame of hope. Ruth is no longer just the betrayed wife. She is the survivor, the fighter, the voice that echoes for those who need to believe that there is still life after chaos. And if you've come this far, listening to Ruth's story, she wants to say something. From the bottom of her heart, pain doesn't have to be the end point of your life. Maybe you're facing a betrayal, a disease, a loss that seems unbearable. Maybe you think you won't be able to handle it, but Ruth is proof that it's possible. It's possible to get up, rebuild yourself, and even transform pain into a new purpose. Don't allow what they did to you to define who you are. You are much more than your pain. You are much more than the lie they told you, than the blow you suffered. You can still write new chapters, chapters that no one else can destroy. And now we want to know, if this story touched your heart, if you've been through something you thought was impossible to bear and managed to get up, share with her in the comments. Your voice can inspire someone who is at rock bottom today. Subscribe to the channel, activate notifications, and join this community of people who believe that even amid ruins it's still possible to flourish, because together we are much stronger.